For over a decade, I shopped and worked at my local comic shop. One of the best parts about hanging out there was comparing notes on what I was reading with folks who shared my passion for comics. My comic shop is gone now, but we can still hold on to the magic of that in-store discussion. This is My Comic Shop Book Club. Welcome to My Comic Shop Book Club. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the second half of the Grant Morrison New X-Men run is returning guest, Mike Sangregorio. Welcome back.
Hi, thank you again for having me.
Of course, we gotta continue our discussion here. So again, this is part 2. So if anyone hasn't listened to or watched part 1 yet, please go do that. For this episode, we'll be covering the second half of Grant Morrison's run. So we're talking issues 135 through 154, and specifically the arcs Riot at Xavier's, Murder at the Mansion, Assault on Weapon Plus, Planet X, and Here Comes Tomorrow. Now, just to sort of tee this up, I want to share with our audience just a little snippet of a text exchange we had recently. I texted you at a couple of points during my reading process. I texted you after Riot at Xavier's, and I'm like, this thing was fire. It was great. I loved it. Then I texted you as I got closer to the end, and I said that it was losing me a little bit. And you wrote something that turned out to be, that couldn't have been any more accurate, which is, you said, yeah, the back half is where things go off the rails and you either hold on for the ride or get tossed. Took me a few rereads to love it like I do. I think I probably fall into the category of someone who got tossed off the ride. That's probably where I land on this. But I want to hear about your reread experience here. Because as we discussed in the previous episode, you have been and remain a big fan of this run. So I'm just curious for you, big picture, how did the second half of this reread hold up for you?
Yeah, for me, it held up very well. I've read this run multiple times since it came out, and I read it on the stands when it shipped. But it holds up for me. It really does. One of the things I like is when you get towards the end of the run, everything goes faster and is very truncated. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why most of the plot points and characters that are introduced in this run aren't followed up immediately in any material way. And most of what is introduced is contradicted almost immediately in some cases. And I feel like that has a lot to do with the fact that there are some big ideas and they just one after the other, and there's really no time for them to breathe. And as I said in the text, rereading it over and over again has allowed me to unpack some of that. But if you read it once, or the first time you read it, or you're reading it while you're reading a dozen other books that are coming out, you don't necessarily have the space to process it. But for me, it still lands, and it still was an incredibly enjoyable reread.
Good. I'm glad that you enjoyed it and that it held up for you. This, obviously we'll get into it. Yeah, I don't know that this is something that I would necessarily go back to. There are definitely, looking at the run as a whole, because I was pretty hot on the first half of the run during our last episode. I really did enjoy it. And overall, would I say that I found this run worthwhile? Yes, honestly, I did. But like I said, the last chunk of it did leave me a bit cold. I don't know that I would necessarily find it worthwhile to now go back and study it and try to process all of it. That being said, E is for Extinction in part 1 of this run, and Riot at Xavier's, the first arc in the what we're going to be talking about tonight. Those were my two favorite arcs in the run, and those are stories that I could see myself going back to reread. I don't know though that I would have it in me to do this entire run again. But so before we fully dive in, just a couple of quick things. As with the last episode, there will be spoilers. The fact that you're wearing your Magneto was right t-shirt kind of tease up some of what we're going to be talking about. So there will be spoilers here. If anyone hasn't ever read the run and doesn't want to be spoiled, go read it first and then check out this episode. And also, as we discussed last time, Grant Morrison goes by they, them. So we will be referring to that creator using those pronouns. We have not lost all sense of grammar. We are respecting the gender identity of the writer of all of these comics. There was this struck me, and you and I had an off-mic conversation when we were done last time, but I actually kind of want to bring a little of that in here because one of the things that we had not talked about ahead of time, really, but that kept coming up in the episode that kind of surprised me, I guess, was I guess the reaction to this run at the time it was coming out, and how much you personally, it seemed, because this came up a number of times in our discussion, how many times you had to defend this run, to friends and fellow, X-Men fans. And I guess it was surprising to me because, as we discussed last time, like I wasn't as plugged into this as it was coming out. So it was just sort of in the periphery for me. I wasn't dialed in like you were. But in our off mic discussion, I did equate it to what I've gone through as a fan of Zack Snyder's DC movies, where it's like I feel like it's a valid interpretation of the characters, but other fans have very specific ideas about how these characters must be presented. Is that sort of the dynamic that you've experienced in defending this run to other people?
I in no way want to equate the Morrison X-Men run to anything done by Zack Snyder. So all I'll say is the Morrison X-Men run had the unfortunate, setting of having absolutely no follow-up. So Grant Morrison left Marvel either once this run was done or shortly thereafter, and immediately, like in the next issue, things started being contradicted. Most notably with Cassandra Nova, who, and again, this is a spoiler, is the character of Ernst. So if you read the second half of this run, a new student is introduced at Xavier's, an elderly-looking woman in what is clearly a child's wig, and the character is known as Ernst, named after the Dada artist Max Ernst. That character is supposed to be Cassandra Nova rehabilitated. That is not spelled out in the text until I think the last issue or the penultimate issue. And that caused some confusion as to where Cassandra Nova was. Was she still in Stuff? Was she in whatever jail X-Men villains usually go to? That's contradicted almost immediately in the next arc. It's actually further contradicted in the Astonishing X-Men arc by Joss Whedon, which I love. Stuff actually appears there, and Cassandra Nova is a villain there. And then almost immediately after the Magneto reveal, which again I love, Chris Claremont, arguably the person who's written more noteworthy Magneto stories than anyone alive, said, "Well, no, that didn't happen. My Magneto, was on Genosha. He was with Professor X, or he is with Professor X. I'm going to tell a different story." So editorial had to work in that the character of Zorn did exist and that he may have had a brother. It's very confusing. It is not a good story. None of the issues I'm discussing is something I would recommend reading. And again, to my original point, none of those stories are ones you're asking to look at 20 years later. So I think that's where part of the confusion came from, is at the time you go to the store on a Wednesday, you buy your issues and you're like, well, why isn't A speaking to B? But again, I've reread the Morrison run many times and I enjoy it for what it is. And if I need to fill in the gaps on how you can get to the other stories, well, Stanley very famously used to give out no prizes for fans who could do that. And I'm sure there's better fanfic writers out there than me who could connect one to the other. But for me, I take the Morrison run as is in microcosm, as I would a movie, or a novel, completely divorced from everything else. And I try to enjoy it that way.
Gotcha. No, fair enough. And, like I said, I'm glad that the run, held up for you, because through this podcast and the Superman one that I've been doing, I've been revisiting a lot of stuff. And I have to say, thankfully, for the most part, what I'm rereading, holds up. And, I'm able to enjoy it in the same way as I did the first time, or some cases I'm enjoying things in a new way, years later. There have been a few instances where I've revisited something and it's like, oh, like this really doesn't live up to what I thought it was in my head. So, so I'm glad that it did for you, I guess. And as much as I know, we could go arc by arc, and I'm sure we will touch on all of the arcs, but I think we just have to dive into the big reveal, as you've already, gotten at here, the big reveal in the second half of this run, that Zorn, this mutant they rescue in the first half of the run, and who becomes a teacher at the school and is a mutant, a man of peace and serenity, and he's meditating, and he has a star for a head, and he can heal, has actually been Magneto in disguise all along. And again, like you said, this is almost immediately after this run contradicted, but within the context of this run in and of itself, what was intended by Grant Morrison, that's, obviously what we're discussing here. And it's in that Planet X storyline that that reveal happens. What was your reaction at the time when you got to that issue and he takes off the helmet and you see that it's actually Eric and it's been Eric all this time?
I didn't understand it because and again, I'm talking about like literally that issue came out that Wednesday and we're all reading it. Um, I didn't understand it because I had thought that Zorn had healed people and had done things and that he had this advanced background in China. And it's not until I reread the series where I realized that A, Zorn doesn't actually heal anyone. Zorn cures everyone of the mutant flu strain that is introduced early on, and then he fixes Charles' legs, all of which is done with the nano sentinels that are introduced in E for Extinction. So again, it's the misdirect. It's like a magic show, right? Like Grant Morrison wanted you to believe that this was a new character, that they were the man in the iron mask, that they had been tortured, and that they were here to teach other mutants so they wouldn't fall into the same misery that they had to live through. But it wasn't. And the reveal is that no, Magneto is back and he's going to do some terrible things. But the follow-up to that, and I think I mentioned this last week, is that Magneto doesn't accomplish anything. This is it's very subversive, and I hate using that word because it's used by a lot of creators that I don't agree with who try to explain kind of outlandish plots. But here, I think it does work because one of the things that Grant Morrison tries to do in most of their fiction is show you why the old paradigms don't work. And with Magneto, it's always been, I want to take over the world so that people like me are safe. As opposed to Professor X, who says, no, we need to all be in this together. That's the only way to create lasting peace. And you see that when Magneto is at the school as Zorn, he actually does reach people and they love him and they make a human contact. And then he throws that all away. And the very first thing they do is say, okay, you're Magneto. That's fine. Where's Zorn? Because we liked him. Like, can you bring him back? So in that, I feel like you are shown why Eric keeps failing time and time again, even if maybe sometimes, especially in Chris Claremont's stories, he's right. So
I will say, and I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to mention it as we got deeper into Planet X, but the funniest bit to me in that storyline and definitely in the second half of this run is Ernst continually asking Magneto, "Where's Mr. Zorn? When's Mr. Zorn coming back?" And he's like, "Damn it, child! There's no Zorn."
We have to pause on that because I love that scene, and I don't just mean I like it or something. I think that scene where it's Ernst asking Magneto where Zorn is a microcosm of the entire X-Men relationship, because you don't realize this the first time you're reading it. And again, it took me a few times to really process all of Morrison's unfulfilled or unfollowed up plot threads. But when you realize that Ernst is Cassandra Nova, who killed 16 mutants, devastated the Shi'ar Empire, outed Professor X, and did all these other things, but was beaten by the X-Men working together and put into a body where she could be rehabilitated. She is the one asking Magneto, where is Zorn? Where is that teacher that was able to reach me after all the trauma I suffered? That's beautiful because Cassandra Nova has arguably accomplished as much, if not more, than Magneto in her much shorter time. And she did it just to annoy her brother. She didn't do it because she wanted to save the race. She can't stand mutants, actually. So when they're having that exchange, it's one of those things where I say, like, I had to read it multiple times. Maybe that's not something that everyone is interested in, but the more I read it, the more I come to appreciate that scene in particular, because I feel like that summarizes the X-Men as a whole, and certainly the Morrison run, where it's like, no, rehabilitation absolutely is possible, and so is integration. And then the follow-up to that scene is, of course, that Cassandra Nova leads the X-Men 150 years in the future, and she is the only one who could ultimately stop the real villain of the entire run.
Yeah, I mean, well said. I guess, it's funny, and we've gotten at this already in talking about Morrison's work, but I guess, for a comic fan or reader, I guess that's one of the questions they have to ask themselves. Like, how much work do you want to do in, reading, understanding, and enjoying a comic? And, I think there are plenty like yourself, right? You enjoy going back and going through it again and maybe, appreciating something that you might not have necessarily honed in on the first time. Whereas others, I think, maybe look for it a little bit more right there on the first read. I guess I fall more into your category, but yeah, I don't know. It's funny. as I said this in the last episode, that I've not read many X-Men comics. So this might sound kind of weird for me to say, because it's not like, oh man, I've been reading X-Men my whole life. But when it came down to this big reveal that it's like, hey, it's been Magneto all along, it just, to me, it just felt like really like the standard villain, because it's like so much of the Morrison run was like these big ideas and new stuff, and it's like, oh, like it was really just a Magneto plot all along. Now, the point you raise is a valid one, and I think for me, if there's any salvation here in this run, is exactly what you pointed at, that it is subversive. It's like he enacts his plan, but it's like he doesn't get the reaction that he wants, and you don't fully go down that road that maybe you did in other stories. So I do get that, and I think that does kind of save it a bit for me. But I think that was sort of my reaction. Where, and in fairness, and this is where this was like the one thing I knew about the run going in, was that Zorn was Magneto, and I mean, I wish I did, and I don't know how I would have taken it if I had been surprised like readers were at the time. I can't answer that. But so I knew going in, but when I got to that point, yeah, it just felt like, oh man, like it's just like, so it's just been another Magneto thing. That was my, I guess that was my gut reaction to it.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. It certainly was a big reveal at the time for me, because I had drank the Kool-Aid. I thought Magneto was dead. I thought he was, because um, the story immediately preceding this was, I think it was called the Magneto War, so something to that effect. Magneto declares war on the rest of the world, having finally gotten the nation of Genosha. It's basically a island nation full of mutants. So he's got a ton of super soldiers. He wants to enact his grand plan, and a scrappy team of X-Men stop him. So I had been reading that, and then he is supposedly killed when the Sentinels attack Genosha. So I was like, okay, great. He's off the playing field. I'm sure he'll come back. It's not a big deal. If Zorn's going to be the villain, he might be a new, interesting villain. He's got a star for a head. Maybe he is related to the Phoenix Force in some way. We know that's going to come back to play. So seeing it was Magneto was almost, I agree with you, a little bit of a letdown. But again, in the context of the larger story, where he effortlessly takes over the city of New York and destroys the X-Men and undoes them, and takes their kids away from them and does all this stuff, and is met with nothing, with people who are like, wait, what are we doing now? By the way, there's no more fresh water. Are you going to fix that? And then there's something else that we've been dancing around that we haven't acknowledged, which is, Magneto's a drug addict, which is the other big reveal here. Because I think I said this to someone in the Facebook group for the podcast, but Magneto is my favorite X-Man. He is one of my favorite characters of all time. He's certainly my favorite X-Man. And I love this story. And I love this story because it shows the dangers of his plan and his plot. So when he is puffing on his drug, and we find more about that drug later on in the story, like he is not in his right mind. So the more ridiculous, the more malicious, the more like, hey, why doesn't this guy resemble the character from God Loves Man Kills, or those movies I like, or anything else? Like, Morrison did give themselves an out. So just want to say that.
Yes. Unfortunately, the out is what was another aspect of the story that didn't really work for me, which, we'll get to. The other funny thing about Magneto's, like, the execution of his plan and the takeover of New York, a lot happens real fast. Like, I was reading it, and all I could think of was Anchorman, the Will Ferrell movie, where they have the newscasters have that big brawl in the park.
Yeah,
and then
okay.
they're recapping, they're regrouping after, and he's like, but that escalated quickly. That was my feeling, like, reading this. Yeah. It was like, whoa. I mean, again, it upped the stakes, in a major way, very efficiently. I don't know, maybe that took me out of it a little bit, just how quickly he took over. But to your point, he doesn't get the reaction that he's looking for. He is all hopped up on Kick, this mutant drug that, like you said, we do learn more about. And there are, in addition to the "Where's Mr. Zorn" bit, there's also that funny runner about it's like the people can't see or hear him because he's too far away. That was funny. I did enjoy that.
Yeah, for those of you who are not familiar with Manhattan, so as far as I can tell, based on the art and my familiarity with Midtown, Magneto and Toad and the other Brotherhood of Evil Mutants are on the MetLife building, which is above Grand Central Terminal, and he is like, they're standing on the roof and they're yelling at people down on Park Avenue. You can't hear him. You can't see him. You can't see anything. So one of my favorite scenes in that arc is where he reduces the jets to rubble and then gets mad that everyone is looking at the jets and not him. And I read that more as a commentary on the old Magneto stories where, Kirby or Neil Adams or any of these guys would draw him with this great big, Jim Lee famously would draw him with this energy bubble around him, and he'd be in the foreground of the story, and he'd be moving asteroids into orbit and threatening to flip poles and doing all these cool things. But it's like, yeah, but if you're floating a couple 100 feet above ground, no one can see you do any of that stuff. It's like, if you really want to be of the people, you have to go down there and be of the people. You can't be standing on this building so that everyone can see how cool you are in your cape and your little helmet.
Yeah, very reminiscent of more recently the Shazam movie, where they had some fun with that idea of them not being able to hear each other as they're fighting, but very far apart in the sky.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely a funny bit. The other thing that I want to make sure that we address is the art here, because we talked about that a lot in the last episode. The fact that there was a lack of consistency in the art teams in the first 20 issues or so. And, you and I expressed that we were not fans of Igor Kordy, who stepped in a bunch of times. And thankfully, one of the things that I really did enjoy a lot about the back half of this run is that we had a lot more consistency with the art. Each arc had its own artist. Phil Jimenez did 2 arcs. But within each arc, you had one artist drawing every issue. And I think that really helped a lot. So yeah, we had... So Frank Quitely did one more arc. He did Riot at Xavier's. Jimenez did Murder at the Mansion. Then Assault on Weapon Plus. What's your pronunciation of the artist's name here?
I call him Chris Bachalo. I do not know if that is correct. I have never met him. I've never heard the name said out loud.
It's funny. I looked up. I searched for him on YouTube, hoping to find an interview where he said his name or where someone said it. And I kid you not, I came across like 2 to 3 videos where the person in the video was like, I'm not really sure how to say his name. So it's like, I don't know. We'll go with that. And then Jimenez comes back for Planet X, and then Mark Silvestri does the last 4-issue arc. Here Comes Tomorrow.
His return to his triumphant return to the X-Men. Mark Silvestri. I couldn't believe it then. I still couldn't believe it reading it now.
Do you have a favorite artist of that group?
I do, yeah. I'm a huge Chris Bachalo fan. I regardless of the fact that I don't know how to pronounce his name, I actually do love his work. He is one of a handful of artists where their name on the book makes me pick it up. Our friend Mark Hammond, like anything that has Chris Bachalo on it, I just buy because I know I'm going to enjoy it, even if it's not a writer that I'm a fan of. And I love Assault on Weapon Plus. It's my favorite in the back half of this, just because I really like Phantom X, and I like the big, over-the-top science fiction action adventure story. I love the one-sentence premise of Assault on Weapon Plus, which is Wolverine gets Cyclops drunk at a strip club, kidnaps him, and goes and invades basically what is the Weapon X project, because he wants to know, what his real name is, who his parents are, basic things that were being revealed in the story origin at the time. And then they meet up with Phantom X and they end up killing a bunch of Justice League analogs. And to me, it's just like, if that had been its own story with no follow-up in Planet X, it still would be one of my favorite X-Men stories of all time. I absolutely love it.
See, okay, so it's funny you say that. I guess I didn't hate it, but I guess I just sort of feel the opposite there. And it's funny, though, where you say that even if there was no follow-up, because I guess that was my feeling, was that I feel like that arc, more than almost any other, and I know you'll disagree with me and you'll say Murder at the Mansion, but I feel like that you could really lift that right out for the most part, and you don't lose too much in the overall run. I did enjoy part 1 of Assault on Weapon Plus with the whole scene in the bar and Cyclops getting drunk. That was great, and I think definitely gives you some fun moments between Logan and Cyclops. I do also like the Phantom X character. That arc, though, at the very beginning of part 2, Morrison was at their most Morrison, I feel, with the world and this dome and the experiments and all that stuff, and
Liquid Time, like you said in our last episode.
Liquid Time. And I tried to do what I did last time and just not get too caught up in it, but it took me a beat to be like, what is going on here? And I guess the whole bit about Logan trying to discover more about his past, that was cool. I guess I just felt, because I remember that Origin had just come out, and that was that era at Marvel, and I don't know, I guess it just kind of felt to me like that was more serving Marvel's ends with that character than it was the main story that was going on. So I don't know. I felt like I didn't fully connect with that arc. And while I do like that artist generally, and there's other stuff that I've enjoyed, I don't know. I didn't. It just didn't work for me totally in that specific arc. I wanted to like it more than I did. But that first issue with Cyclops, at the Hellfire Club, and then having the drinking contest with Logan, that was fun. I really did like that. The rest of it was a little more. I don't know. It was a little tougher for me to connect with.
I think what you're saying makes perfect sense, because that arc doesn't make any sense, to your point, if you don't know what's going on in the wider Marvel universe, right? If you don't know that Wolverine's origin is being told in a separate book you may or may not be reading for the first time since the character's inception, then a lot of this isn't going to make sense. It's going to be like, well, I know he's got false memories and whatnot, and they go through this in the second film, but like, why is this so important now? The other thing to point out, since you mentioned the larger Marvel universe, is, I don't know if you noticed, but in this arc, they start breaking out Weapon Plus and Weapon X. The reason for that is that there was a Weapon X ongoing at the time. And again, it's not bad, but it's not a book that I'm going to go back and read 20 years later. It was a very different type of book, and it was its own thing. But that was part of what was going on here. I think the reason I like Assault on Weapon Plus so much is, I love the idea that whomever is in charge of making the Sentinels would say, well, we now have enough super technology under our control. Let's make a superhero team. Let's give them a satellite base in orbit, and let's convince the human beings down there that the big seven superheroes are going to save them from the mutant race. And I just love the idea that whoever is in charge of the military industrial complex in the Marvel Universe said, you know how we get rid of mutants? The Justice League, and they're all going to be built from Sentinel technology. So that just tickles me as a fan of comics.
I wish I felt similarly tickled. I really, I mean, I wish I would, again, you and I, we just, for anyone who hasn't checked it out, you and I did, it's out now. We did an episode of Digging for Kryptonite. We talked about Tom Welling's return appearance as the Clark Kent of Smallville.
And Erica Durance.
Yes, I know, I know. But I didn't have as much of an objection with what they did to her. I guess that's why I always zero in on Clark. But, we had a whole discussion about that. You and I felt very differently about it, and we had a great discussion. And as I said in that episode, it's like I'm not trying to get you to dislike it. It's like I wish I felt the same. Let's take a 30-second commercial break, and then we'll continue discussing the second half of this run. We'll be right back. The Hive Comics and Games is an oasis of nerd fun and events in the heart of Odessa, Texas. Whether it's comic book superhero stories or role-playing in a dungeon, the Hive is where to be. Come tap your mana and face off against the top Magic the Gathering players in West Texas. Hive carries a majority of new comic titles each Wednesday and has all of your favorite titles in their back issue section. Follow them on Facebook at The Hive Comics and on Instagram at The Hive Comic Shop. All right, and we're back. So Assault on Weapon Plus, that was your favorite arc of the second half of the run?
Sure. Well, the reason for that is what you were saying before about how that escalated very quickly. This one is kind of self-contained. You get the big reveal at the end that, hey, it's Asteroid M, and these Sentinels aren't going to work for anything in particular. Whereas the other stories, I don't feel like you can read on their own. You can't pull Planet X off shelf and read it. You need to know what happens next, and it'd be nice if you knew what happened before. But Assault on Weapon Plus is just nice. It's a good science fiction story. It's funny. It gives Cyclops something to do that doesn't involve whether or not he's sleeping with the White Queen. It's just like, to me, it's just a solid X-Men story. I feel like Assault on Weapon Plus is one of those stories that if it come out 10 or 15 years before, it would have been an episode of X-Men the animated series. Would have been like, hey, this one-off French mutant is going to kidnap Cyclops and Wolverine and invade a space station, or invade the world, and all its philosophical underpinnings. But yeah, for me, that is just a good solid run, and I've probably reread that more than most of the other ones.
Gotcha. It's fun. I mean, again, like I said, to me, it felt like this detour, but I get what you're saying, where there's an appeal in something like that. So I do get what you're saying. I think for me, the highlight definitely was Riot at Xavier's. I thought that was I mean, I was really on board for that. The story about Quentin Quire, assembling this team of students at the school, revolting against Xavier's, mission statement and message of integration with the humans. I thought it was cool. I thought it built on, all of these ideas that had been, discussed and debated at the Xavier Institute over the course of the first half of the run, and X-Men generally, right? Like what is their role in the world going to be? And you get to see these students who don't identify with that and want to take it in a different direction. So that arc I thought was really cool. What was your take on that one?
I would say that Riot at Xavier's is probably objectively the best arc of what we read this time around for a bunch of reasons. One, of course, the art. When the two of those people get together, it's unparalleled. I mean, it's Kirby and Lee. But also to your point, it's the most consistent interpretation of the message, right? Quentin is a student at the school. And by the way, do you know what he's referencing when he's holding up a newspaper article about the way he chooses to dress? Do you know what that's a reference to?
No.
Oh, okay. So this is actually a pretty interesting piece of information. He is holding up an article that was first introduced in the book Marvels by Alex Ross and Kurt Busiek back I think in the early 90s. I don't know the exact year, but in that comic there is a subplot about the introduction of mutants and how, unlike the other superheroes, they're to be feared. They might be your neighbor, who knows what's going on. There is a piece of art that it was either created for that or that Alex Ross used that is what Quentin Quire is holding up and showing to everyone and saying, this is how they thought we were going to dress when we enslaved them. Well, then let's meet their expectation. Let's get our hair cut this way. Let's have outfits made like this. So I thought that was a cool callback, because while I do agree with a lot of people that Morrison's ideas can be kind of large and require a lot of work, and I'm not saying that's a good thing. It's something that I enjoy, but I understand it's not for everything. They do know their continuity. I mean, they really do. They take all this stuff in and they process it, and they pick apart the best things that they like, and they try to give it back to you. So I don't think that that's a criticism that can be lobbied against them. But I think objectively that Riot at Xavier's is the best arc of this back half. I think that's the one that, if you had only known of X-Men through the movies, that is one of the ones I would give you to say, no, these things are much smarter than you may have been led to believe.
Yeah, and it's funny when you mention all of that, and it's true. I mean, Morrison clearly, and you see this with the Batman run as well. There were so many callbacks to these old stories that you would never even think of, but that Morrison is a fan of, and they brought that in. And so, keeping that in mind, yeah, it probably does make sense that they would use Magneto, right? It's like if they're going to write their definitive X-Men story, it's like, well, of course Magneto's going to be behind. It's like it does kind of, it does kind of make sense. But yeah, I loved Riot at Xavier's. That was the arc, right, where we start to get, and correct me if I'm wrong, because maybe there was stuff earlier on that I didn't pick up on, but is it in that arc where we really start to get the first real hints that there's something up with Zorn? Because isn't that where he has his class in the woods and the U-Men attack, right? And then he's taking them apart?
Yeah. He actually says to, I believe it's Angel Salvador, well, this is going to be our little secret. And at first it's like, well, it's not really a big deal because you've been locked in a prison for X amount of years, and you just killed a bunch of terrorists trying to murder children. So it's like, oh, okay, I'm not going to lose any sleep over that. But yeah, upon reread, that is the first time where you realize that Zorn might not be the super pacifist we've been led to think he is, because obviously he's asking a child to keep a secret for him.
And then there's another instance too, right, where Quentin Quire is, going through a secondary mutation, or dying essentially, right? And Zorn puts him out of his misery, but Quire talks about how the enemy is from within, right? Was some bit like that?
Yeah, exactly. And that was I don't remember, one of the times I reread this thing, that was one of the times I realized, Zorn doesn't actually have the ability to heal people, because right. If you could almost picture, now that it's Magneto, now that that it's a senior citizen in a very hot iron mask standing over this kid with dumb hair, saying oh no, don't worry, in my Eastern philosophy, you're about to become one with the universe or whatever. translates to, I can't heal this kid. I don't have healing abilities and I don't know what the heck is going on here, but I know he's powerful enough that if I just say some nonsense, these dopes, the X-Men, these people I have no respect for that have been fighting since they're teenagers, are just going to believe me. And it works. Like um, Quentin evolves, to use the term of the realm, and then you see him again at the very last issue. You see him in the room with the other Phoenix Bearers, and it's interesting to note that when we began this episode, I said that most of the plot points that had been introduced here weren't followed up. Quentin's not one of them. Kid Omega, his super name, he landed. I think he's still in the books now. He's great. He's one of those characters where it's like, you know what, you are clearly going to be a supervillain. And if we expel you, we're going to have to fight you. So we're going to keep you in this school as long as possible, and we're going to try to win you over. Because if we win you over, then we know we're on the right path. It's basically the Ernst plot line with more cohesion. And there's a great issue of Jason Aaron's Wolverine and the X-Men, where you actually see Kid Omega in the future leading his own X-Men squad, very similar to the way Cassandra Nova is. So I love that character. I love Quentin Quire.
I was going to ask you this as, more towards the end, but I don't want to forget, and I think this is a perfect spot for it. So I don't know if I would fall into this category. Maybe I would. But for anyone who, is a fan of the Morrison X-Men run and wants, obviously this was it as far as what Morrison wrote, but for anyone who sort of wants the thematic, the spiritual successors to this run, obviously we've mentioned Astonishing X-Men. What else would you recommend if someone really was into this run and wanted more in that vein?
I got to be honest with you. There's not much. There really isn't. There are plenty of great X-Men stories that followed this run, and there are plenty of great stories at Marvel that were clearly inspired by this. But the real heady, the real complicated stuff, I just can't think of anything offhand. Anyone who enjoyed all this and is hearing me babble on about this nonsense and says, "Hey, that bald guy is making sense," please read The Invisibles. I can't recommend that enough. I think it's one of the greatest works of literature ever made. It inspired The Matrix. So a lot of the same themes are there. For those listeners who are a fan of the Doom Patrol, the show that's on HBO Max, so Grant Morrison also wrote most of the comics that's pulling from. And though that is an earlier work, it is some of the same themes. It's actually a little more raw and just as good, though. So definitely check that out. I think I mentioned in the first episode that, Anthony, you should absolutely read those comics if you get a chance. But the number one X-Men story that I would recommend to anyone listening to this is what I just mentioned, Wolverine and the X-Men by Jason Aaron. Everyone knows Astonishing X-Men. It was written by Joss Whedon. It had a motion comic. Part of it had been adapted into film, but not enough people have read the Wolverine and the X-Men run. It is all about the kids at the school and what they go through, and it's almost like a Harry Potter story. So if you enjoyed any of those dynamics, just the random mutants and their coming of age story in a giant private school where Anthony and I live, absolutely check out Wolverine and the X-Men by Jason Aaron. It's got a wide variety of artists, which is why I'm not picking one over the other.
Gotcha. No, I appreciate the recommendations, as I'm sure our audience does as well. It's funny when you mentioned, where we live, right? We're both from Westchester. I remember, and I'm sure you had a similar experience. I remember seeing the first X-Men movie in theaters when it came out, and the first time that they mentioned Westchester, the crowd erupted. Everybody was very excited that our place got name checked like that. Did you have a similar experience?
I did, yeah. I saw it I saw X-Men 1 in New Rochelle, New York, and I was incredibly excited for the movie, and the entire time I was on cloud nine. Actually, it's funny. Our friend Brandon Montclair included the White Plains Galleria in an issue of Devil Dinosaur and Moon Girl, and the X-Men have to go there because Forge has hidden a time machine there, and that is one of my favorite comics of all time because that is literally where I used to go to buy comics. So seeing that in an issue of this comic from this guy I know who's a local, yeah, that's one of those things where it's like it makes sense for the characters, but I love it because of how personal it is.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. And that is a very fun title. In fairness, I only read the beginning part of it, but I loved it, and I always meant to read more. Maybe that'll be a future book club discussion. But yes, people should check out Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur.
if you ever do, and I know I beat this drum quite often, please read the original Devil Dinosaur, written and drawn by Jack Kirby. It's very brief. It is completely ridiculous, but it's a great segue into what Brandon does.
Gotcha. Cool. So with Riot at Xavier's, I know, you had mentioned that you were a big fan of the Stepford Cuckoos. They have the big development there where it's Sophie, right, who sacrifices herself to stop Choir. And then the survivors spill the beans about the psychic affair between Emma Frost and Cyclops to Jean Grey, and we have that big confrontation. And then that arc ends, right, with Emma Frost found in her diamond form, shot and shattered into a million pieces, which kicks off our Murder at the Mansion. All right, now, why didn't you like that arc?
Well, it's not that I didn't like Murder at the Mansion. It's just, for me, it feels like a filler episode. Like, I had to check that Grant Morrison actually wrote it, because it doesn't star our cast of characters. It stars Bishop and Sage, who were starring in a book called Extreme X-Men, who was running concurrent to this run at the time. So it's not that I dislike it. It's just, if I had to rank all of the issues and arcs from the Grant Morrison run, that would be at the bottom, just because it has the least to do with everything else. The other thing I don't like about it is I don't find the character of Bishop to be very interesting. I like him. I like him in the comics when he premiered in the 90s. I love him on the show. But now I kind of feel like, why are you still hanging around? Like, you clearly prevented whatever catastrophe was going to happen. Like, I just feel like people are constantly scrounging for things to do with him. And as more evidence to this is not me picking on him. Following the Morrison run, he would actually be the only X-Man to side with Iron Man during the superhero Civil War, because as a law enforcement officer, he feels that he should be on the side of law and order. So he gets like beaten up by Captain America in Civil War, and then shortly after that, he becomes like a full tilt supervillain trying to kill a baby. So when I say I don't think writers quite know what to do with Bishop after his initial plotline was wrapped up, I'm not pulling that out of thin air. But I think it's a good story, because I think it's like a procedural, which I guess is okay. But yeah, when I do my reread, it's like, oh, okay, these are the fill-in issues, regardless of the fact that the artist and writer are the core artist and writer of the book.
No, that's fair enough. Again, it's funny. I think when we're talking about a lot of these arcs, I think you and I sort of classify them in the same way, but we have a different overall reaction to them. So for me, that's why I like that arc, was that it was a mutant murder procedural or crime procedural. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting, like a mutant murder investigation. And it is the shortest arc, and certainly within the second half of the run. It's only 3 issues. I liked it. I mean, I know, honestly, I know next to nothing about Bishop, so I didn't have any real opinion coming in on that. The greatest connection I have to Bishop, and going back to White Plains, New York, is that, and there might be some people who are familiar.
I really teed you up for that one. That was nice.
When you said that, I'm like, there we go. So, because when I was reading it, I was like, I don't know if I would bring up the comics retailer named Bishop, but now we have our segue. So yeah, so there was a long defunct comic shop in White Plains called Comic Book Heaven, and the longtime manager there, his real name was Keith, but I mean, I should probably just let you. I mean, do you want to just take this and explain?
Yeah, no, I shopped there many years. Actually, I shopped there before I shopped at AR. So, yeah, no, Bishop was the general manager at the store. He vaguely looked like the character of Bishop, and he was great. He gave me my books every week. We would talk. He was a big influence on me learning about the older stuff, because again, this is the days before the internet. This is the days before you could just look all this stuff up. There weren't YouTube background videos on every Easter egg. You had to talk to people, and I would talk to Bishop. I would say, hey, by the way, there was a character in this issue that I didn't recognize. Can you give me the one sentence? And he'd be like, yeah, sure, let me walk you through that. So yeah, Bishop was a comic dealer in White Plains, New York, and my comic dealer for many years. But yeah, fictional Bishop and he, my goodness, the 2 worlds between that gulf,
Yeah, well, I mean, so the retailer, right, he loved the character of Bishop and went by that name, and I believe, right, he actually had his name legally changed to Bishop.
Oh, I've never heard that. I didn't know that.
Don't hold me to that, but I believe, if even if he didn't go that far, that was certainly how everyone knew him. The funniest thing, and I've mentioned this on the My Comic Shop History podcast, but in my mind, because that was not my regular shop, but I would go there from time to time. And I think Comic Book Heaven's claim to fame was their back issue selection. You would pay for if you needed something. We called it the Bishop tax, right? Bishop would he'd pull the books that you asked for. They were all, but there were some back issues out front, but the vast majority were in the back room. So you would hand Bishop your list. He would go back there. He would pull out what you needed. He would sit down with the price guide and tell you how much each was going to be. And it was always more than cover price, at least in my experience. Hence the Bishop tax. But so, I would go there from time to time as a kid when I needed to fill in gaps in my collection. And I guess as a kid, like I always was like, oh, like this guy's huge. And then I remember seeing him at a convention, not too many years ago. And I was like it just did not match this larger than life image I had of him in my head from all those years. But yeah. So reading that arc, I did think of the comics retailer named Bishop.
Yeah, no, and if he watches this, I miss him very much. He was great. But yeah, that arc is funny because the climax of it is really, hey, we had a bunch of mutant babies and we don't want to tell anyone about it, which I always think is hilarious because it's like, what did you think was going to happen? Like you're in a school with other weird mutants. It's just so funny of like, Morrison was one of the first people to say, wait a second, teenagers are ridiculous. How would they actually react to this? They wouldn't tell Cyclops or the redhead who's constantly on fire. They might just go out to a cabin and hope for the best.
Yeah, right. Angel and Beak, they're
Yeah.
children, and I think Xavier says that to them right when they find out. It's like, what did you think we were going to do? Like, it's okay, but you're right. I think probably as misguided youths in a situation they don't know how to handle, their response probably does track. Even though you can kind of look at it and it's like, why did you think you needed to hide this necessarily?
Well, it's even better than that because Professor X says to Beak at least, well, who told you this? And Beak doesn't respond because Beak is flustered. He's worried about his children. But the answer to that question would be, well, Zorn. Zorn told me this, but they don't get a chance to say that on paper. It's the same thing with the conclusion of the arc. Uh, Jean or Sage, I don't remember exactly who, but someone says, well, whoever shot Emma, it wasn't Angel Salvador. She's barely 5 foot. It was someone who was at least 6 feet tall. It's Zorn. They never say this explicitly on the page, but I always point to things like this as a way of saying that, unlike other big reveals in comics, because this is a trope, the big reveal, the friend is the villain is your friend. This, I believe, as far as I know, was from the beginning, was from the introduction of Zorn, which is in issue 4 of the whole thing. And this is one of the things where I point to where it's like, no, Zorn was always intended to be Magneto. This was not a last minute change so that you could prop up the book's numbers. And Murder at the Mansion is an excellent way of outlining that, of no, this is what Magneto was trying to do. He was trying to sow dissent among the next generation because he wanted to be in charge of that next generation. So I think Murder at the Mansion is amazing setup for, as you said at the beginning, the roller coaster that is about to begin. After Murder at the Mansion, that's it. It's all the events take place in what could only be a couple of days. I mean, it's an incredibly dense series of story arcs.
I wanted to ask you because again, I think like I said, a few things that I definitely noticed, and I knew what the reveal was going to be, so I was kind of thinking about that as I was reading. But just in terms of what Magneto's actual plan was. I think you just gave a couple of examples of things that he did do to kind of sow dissent. And I think there's a mention later on too about the Magneto was right posters. Are we supposed to believe that he was responsible for that as well?
Yeah, I absolutely do. One of the things that they say is they say that Zorn is the teacher of the special class, capital S, capital C. And one of the character goes, oh, this is the special ed class. And then later on, Professor X says, well, no, that class is for people who've been through trauma. Zorn is someone who went through trauma, and as a healer, we hope he can help you through this and that you can help him through this. So again, it's that misinformation. Magneto believes he is the king of any realm he finds himself in, and that includes the special class of the Xavier Institute. So he puts up the special posters, and he tells the kids these things that, since they're not in the gen pop, they're not in the general student population, they're not going to repeat to others. He wants to make his own brotherhood. One of the things I was trying to say before, I don't know if I articulated it well, is that the big reveal in Planet X that the Brotherhood of Mutants has returned, there are all these kids from the special class. Like Toad is thrown in there because he was in the movies. He was pretty popular at the time, but for the most part, it's just like it's the kids no one else wanted, and it's kind of like you're Magneto, you're the master of magnetism, you're one of the top 5 greatest fictional villains of all time. This is the best you could do. Like you might not be at the top of your game here, guy.
Right. And then, so, we had talked a lot about Assault on Weapon Plus already. So do you want to jump to Planet X, or is there anything else that you want to say about those first few arcs?
The only thing I would say about the Assault on Weapon Plus is one of the things I noticed this time around was the character of Ultimaton or Ultimaton. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Weapon 15. I love that at no point during any of these story arcs does he actually harm anyone. All he does is talk about the nature of reality and the nature of existence, because he was raised in the world, which is this like bubble of time that doesn't exist in the same way you and I would experience time or the other characters would experience time. So I love watching him be like, wait, there's a whole world out there? What does this mean? Like, this character is introduced as one of the most powerful characters in the Marvel Universe, but all they do is like babble on like a teenager talking about philosophy. So that was just one of the things that I really enjoyed, because that's like a Morrison trope where it's like, well, the character has absolute power and all they're interested in doing is talking about the world around them and their connection to it. So I just appreciated that. I thought it was kind of funny.
Right on. Yeah. So, then in the Planet X story, I mean, this is where, everything comes to a head. Zorn is finally reveals himself as Magneto. I did think the most effective reveal during that whole sequence was that that Xavier had not actually been healed. And that, like you said, it was the nano sentinels that were, under Magneto's control that were allowing him to walk all this time, which, Eric immediately takes away. And I thought that was a powerful moment. And I think that really sold like, whoa, like this is what's been going on all along. And then again, yeah, things happen real fast. I mean, in talking about what Magneto's plan had been, we do get some specifics, and there are some more, practical plans that he's put into motion, right? So, Logan and Jean end up stranded on asteroid M in outer space that Eric had manipulated to be there at that time. Emma and Beast are in the jet and it explodes, so they're stranded. They're out of commission. The message that I don't think we talked about this in the first episode, but there's an issue earlier on, right, where a bunch of the mutants are on Genosha, kind of going through the rubble, looking for survivors, that sort of thing, and they find a message from Magneto. And we find out that broadcast like infected the telecommunication systems across the world. So you get a little bit more of a sense of how far reaching this is and what the goal is as he's taking over New York.
Yeah, it's funny. There's one thing I wanted to mention just in case anyone brings it up, but since this arc concluded, there was another very well-regarded story about Magneto's time in the Holocaust, where it's revealed that his real name is Max. So for anyone listening who's wondering why we're not calling him Max, in this text they refer to him as Eric, in the films they refer to him as Eric. I know his real name is Max, but that was later on, so we're not going to bring that up here. Obviously, Charles doesn't refer to him as that. But yeah, to your point, I love that someone must have sat Grant Morrison down and said, hey, wait a second, you just took over Manhattan. There are like 5 million superheroes who live here. What are you gonna? And then there's that line about the black hole bomb and the outer boroughs. There's this line about how we put up a magnetic shield around the entire island. There's this other line about how the message from the earlier arc is now blacking out all communication. Like, it's one of those things where it's like, if you didn't know that the X-Men lived, a couple of train stations away from the Avengers, none of this stuff would be necessary. But because this was coming out every month alongside all these other books, you had to have it in there. But to me, it's just like, all right, whatever. Like, yeah, could you have the Avengers show up? Sure, but that's not the story they were trying to tell. They were trying to say, well, how would the X-Men deal with their old frenemy being super high and deciding that this was their moment in the sun?
Yeah. Speaking of moment in the sun, what another segue. We have that whole sequence with Logan and Jean, on the asteroid and running out of air and burning up. And she's in so much pain that he, basically impales her the same way we saw in the movie as well. But in
Yeah.
this case, of course, it unleashes the full Phoenix force and they're saved. But I thought that was an emotional sequence there, and obviously you see the love between the two of them, and what he was willing to do in order to try to grant her a little moment of peace at the end. There was there anything about that their moments up there that stood out to you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, Phil Jimenez is amazing. He is an amazing artist, and that type of very tender moment between two over-the-top superheroes, he is the perfect artist for that. I love that scene because you see it as a mirror of what Scott was going through with Emma, right? Scott is interested in Emma because Emma's not going to be fazed by any nonsense that's going to come out of Scott's mouth because Emma's been through the ringer. So has Jean. Again, Jean has incredible trauma in her life. She just processes it in a different way. And it's a way that Logan understands. And I like that because it says, it's not that you don't look at other people and have a connection with them, but at the end of the day, love is something different. Scott loves Jean, Jean loves Scott, regardless if that love will even destroy the world, which we see in the last issue. But I love the fact that, at no point do Logan and Jean kiss or make it official, but Logan is willing to do the last thing in the world that he wants to do, which is take her life to give her the moment of peace. And he's so out of it. He is so oxygen deprived or whatever else that he's not thinking straight. Because if he was, he'd say, wait a second, I remember going through this on the moon. I probably shouldn't kill her. Like that might create more problems. But I do love when she comes back as the Phoenix because I love the idea that Jean Grey is more powerful than, again, a founding X-Man is more powerful than any of the villains they will ever face. Because I feel like that's what makes the franchise very compelling. It's like you can stop Magneto and the Juggernaut and Sublime and all these other external threats, but you'll never be able to put Jean back together. Like she will go through this trauma as the Phoenix, no matter how many times you try to prevent it, because it's just the most interesting story. So yeah, to answer your original question, I love that scene. I think it's a beautiful moment.
Yeah, and I love when Cyclops enters the scene and just finally cuts loose. I mean, we've spent so long with him repressing everything that he has inside, and then to just sort of let all of that loose on Magneto, I thought was really badass. It was a badass moment. I enjoyed it.
Well, he's very good with the depressed, as you know, and I
That's
would
right.
say that I was thinking of that line the entire time I was reading this, where I was like, "Man, I got so distracted by the sex joke." Anthony's right; that's an amazing line. But yeah, I like it because it goes back to really X-Men 1, where it's like Cyclops is the field leader of this team. He's the first X-Man. He represents what the team is trying to do, and Magneto is their first enemy, is their polar opposite. So just watching the two of them unload on each other, and Scott just being like, why are you doing, like, we worked so hard against so many other threats, why are you doing this? You could have stayed as Zorn for 100 years, no one would have noticed. So yeah, I agree. I thought it was a beautiful release for what the character had been going through.
And especially, I mean, obviously, the Zorn reveal was a betrayal for all of them, but I mean, especially for Scott. I mean, he's very good with the depressed. He was the one who talked Zorn down in that annual from going supernova or whatever and killing himself. So, and they've had their adventures together and everything. So, escaping the Shi'ar Empire. So, yeah,
Yeah.
that was really, I thought that was a cool moment. But of course, Jean pays the price for it. And, we end another big X-Men arc with how many deaths is this for Jean? I mean, I know Emma makes fun of that in the
Oh man.
in the next arc, but
It's so funny too because you name her Phoenix, right? And you think, oh, this is great. She's got fire abilities and she's got telekinesis. But like, if you read the original myth, it's like, no, she's going to die, and she's going to die pretty consistently. And I feel like Marvel's been very good, even in the movies, of being like, well, no, this character is going to continuously go through this cycle of rebirth. But yeah, I mean, Emma kind of hangs a lantern on it. It's like, this is like the eighth time you people have buried her. She'll be back. And she was back. I mean, she came back in a book called X-Men Red, and I think she's dating Cyclops. I don't even know what's going on in the current book, but yeah, I feel like, again, I always go back to the point where even if you don't like everything Grant Morrison did, or anything Grant Morrison did, I certainly know people like that. I find it very difficult to point to an instance where the X-Men don't act like the X-Men. Like, again, I feel like they really understood the core concepts of these characters. They just weren't interested in telling the same stories. They wanted to say, well, what comes next? You know, I'm probably going to end up back at DC. Where do I want to leave these characters that's different than where I found them, but still marketable, still recognizable for the people watching them on the big screen? And again, I feel like they accomplished it. I know not everyone feels that way, but I do feel like they were able to evolve the characters and kind of push them to the next level and allow them to do more as a franchise. So.
Yeah. Yeah. No, fair enough. And, you know, again, it's hard for me to really speak to that without, again, you follow this so, you know, far more closely, but, I mean, I guess the fact that I only have a relative, like, compared to you, a relatively tangential relationship with these characters. And even though I didn't love everything about this run, I was still able to you know, to follow it and to know the characters, and you know, it felt true to at least this general sense of what I know about the characters. So I think there really is something to, you know, to what you're saying. And, you know, we talked about how, again, Morrison does subvert what you think will happen when Magneto, you know, tries to take over, and his message doesn't land, and he doesn't garner the reaction that he expected. And I think it's Xavier, or maybe it was someone else, who says you should have remained the legend, that message that you sent everyone. You would have been more impactful in that way than going this route. And I thought that was effective.
Yeah, and I agree completely. I think the idea of Magneto is more important than him as a person, because the idea of Magneto can be set against whatever the X-Men want to stand for on that day. I mean, this shirt is subversive. It's based on the Che Guevara, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, shirt, but it's this idea of reducing a real person who had a real struggle and a complicated life and a contradictory life to an image, because an image can be made to stand for whatever you want. And that's the point of the character. Like, Magneto was being reduced and reduced and reduced, and him returning doesn't strengthen that image, it weakens it, because he gathers to him a bunch of people that he wants to teach and instruct. But what he finds out is that by being the despot, like he is with Toad, who he just commands around and says, you've been following me for decades, do what I say, don't question me, just let me have that relationship. It doesn't work. And Toad can't magically change things. And all Magneto wants to do is gloat in front of Professor X. And again, I love this because I love watching the character kind of hit this wall. And it would have been really interesting if he had been able to come back and the kick was able to go out of his system and he'd been able to kind of explain what he really wanted to do here, or even go back to the school. I mean, for those of you who don't know, Magneto has been an X-Man many times. I think he's an X-Man now, actually. So this idea of like him being at the school, it's not completely out of left field. Most of the times he doesn't pretend to be a Chinese immigrant, but it's worked in the past. So it's something that's pretty consistent with his character. And again, I just like the fact that he doesn't get what he wants because he doesn't really know what he wants. He knows how he feels, but he can't articulate that into a strategy that accomplishes him anything.
Yeah, and so like I said before, as much as there is a big part of me that's like, okay, this is what it all comes down to, another Magneto story. But I did like the path that it took from that point. Although, and this I guess is a good jumping off point to the issue that I had with the final arc here and the revelation about the bacteria, which I'm just going to leave to you to explain. But I guess the thing that kind of bugged me a little bit was that I like going back to Riot at Xavier's, I like the idea that not all of the students agree with Charles. And I think that's still there, but the idea that you also had Magneto as Zorn manipulating events, I just don't know how necessary that is. I feel like that does take something away a little bit from a genuinely interesting ideological clash. I think that's part of the problem that I have with this idea that like he's been kind of influencing things, as Zorn all that time. And kind of on that note, that brings us to the Here Comes Tomorrow arc. Where can you just explain the sublime of it all? Because I know you've studied it, and I'll rather leave it to you.
Sure. But before we get to that, I just want to say something about what you were saying. I agree. I think it does take away from that, but I think that's on purpose. And I always point to the fact that the X-Men in this arc, they almost seem incompetent. And I feel like a lot of that is due to the fact that Morrison has them focus on the bigger picture. Charles keeps talking about open day. He wants humans to come here. He wants to push his message forward. But they're missing what's going on in their own house, right? They're missing what's going on with Zorn. They didn't know this girl was pregnant, like a lot of things like
Sure.
that. And I feel like this is pretty consistent with Morrison's message. To go back to the Batman run, which you and I have discussed in a previous episode, um, this is what happens. Spoilers for Batman Incorporated. This is what happens at the end of Batman Incorporated. Like Damian Wayne Robin dies in action because his parents aren't paying attention to him. Like Batman, the hero, and Talia, the villain, both fail the only thing that they claim matters to them, which is their son. It's the same way here. Professor X and Magneto say they both care about the mutant species more than anything else. Neither one of them does a great job at servicing them. Like the X-Men and the school are great in the larger scheme of things, but again, humans are still attacking mutants, and if Super Sentinels are bearing down on your island home, Magneto would have been a pretty cool defender to have. So you can kind of see both sides at times before you get into the genocidal tendencies. But I do think that was something Morrison was going for specifically, to show that when you focus on all this drama and all this soap opera above what you claim your mission is, you fail, and sometimes you fail in ways you don't expect.
Well said. I mean, that's why again, you're the perfect person to talk to about all of this because I know how much thought you've put into it, and you spent a lot of time with the material, and so I think you're able to again find these angles that maybe for a first time reader wouldn't necessarily grab onto necessarily. But so, all right. So then the final arc, the final 4 issues of
Yeah.
this run, Here Comes Tomorrow, Mark Silvestri on art. It's a future story. We're 150 years into the future. I guess there too. And again, I know this is weird for me to say. Like I'll out myself. I've never read Days of Future Past. I've seen the movie. I've never read the
Okay.
comic, but I know the gist of it. And so I guess there too, it's just like, okay, so all of this was a Magneto plot. Magneto's been used over and over. Okay, here's another future story. I guess that's where a part of the reason why the end of this run lost me a little bit, because I just felt
Mhm.
like for all the talk that we've had about Morrison, like, oh, he's so out there, so different. And then I just felt like, oh, okay. And again, like we said, it makes sense, right? If this is going to be their stamp on the X-Men, if they're a fan of these aspects or those other storylines, like it would make sense that they would weave them in that way. So I do get it,
Yeah.
but I was a little bit let down that it felt like it was a little bit of a rehash, but obviously went in its own direction.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think one of the important things to remember about Here Comes Tomorrow is that it it is an alternate future, a post-apocalyptic future, just like Days of Future Past, which, by the way, was one of the first times that mainstream comic books did that and said, "Hey, we're gonna check in on the future. Our heroes are not where you want them to be." And by the way, at the end of the story, Days of Future Past is only 2 issues. We're not 100% sure they actually accomplished anything. Actually, Bishop, who I mentioned before, is from that reality, and the fact that he shows up years after proves that no, somewhere all those characters still died. Um, but yeah, to answer your earlier question, Here Comes Tomorrow, Planet X, and a lot of the other things make sense once you understand who Sublime was. And again, I read this thing when it was coming out and I had no idea what was going on. This took a lot of research, which was something I enjoyed, but I understand that's not for everyone. So, in the simplest way I can explain it, my understanding is that Sublime is sentient bacteria. So it is the germs that can think for itself. And it's been on planet Earth for a couple of billion years. It watched lower life evolve into humans, evolve into mutants, and it does not like that. In the last episode, I said that Phantom X was Gambit done right. And by that, I meant I found Phantom X to be very interesting, while having a lot of overlap with Gambit, who I never found to be all that compelling. Also, Gambit wears a head sock. I don't get it. In this way, I would say that Sublime is very similar to the character of Apocalypse. Before Morrison began their run, the character of Apocalypse bonded with Cyclops and they became something different. Apocalypse is never referenced by that name during this run. They're only ever referred to by their real name, or his real name, En Sabanur. Uh, I think one of the reasons for that is Morrison wanted to use this idea of survival of the fittest, which is based on my limited understanding how evolution works, right? So, like, we're here because our ancestors were better able to adapt to the environment than their peers. And I think it's the same way in the context of the X-Men. The X-Men are that concept formalized and given weird science fiction elements. So Sublime is a response to that. Sublime says, well, I've survived without evolving all of these, millennia. And now I'm here, and now I can't stand the fact that you're about to inherit the earth, because in E for Extinction, we learn the human race only has a few generations left. And that is a drop of rain to Sublime, who, again, has been here longer than any other fictional character, as far as I know. Um, so Sublime takes over the Beast, who is a very hardy creature now that he's undergone his secondary mutation. He renames himself the Beast of Revelation. He has his final human, excuse me, Apollyon. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's also from the Book of Revelation. And the idea is that Sublime is going to finally make its move. It's going to, destroy mutants, destroy humans, become the most powerful thing, take Phoenix into itself. Now, all of that happens in Here Comes Tomorrow, but the big deal is that in Here Comes Tomorrow, you realize that Sublime has been manipulating events through the entire run. So Sublime was introduced as John Sublime, but that was just its human host. It created the U-Men. It funded the Super Sentinel program, which led to the Justice League analog I was talking about before. In the spin-off book, Weapon X, that I mentioned, Sublime actually cameos as the head of that program. They presumably have infinite wealth from being older than the concept of money. And then the other big reveal, which drives a lot of what we're talking about with Magneto and whether or not that lands, is that Zorn, again, as sentient germs, Sublime as sentient germs, is Kick. It exists as this aerosol form. So every time you see a character take a hit of Kick, they are actually giving part of themselves over to this enemy that they have no idea exists. So again, I only got that upon my reread, and it probably wasn't my first reread. I probably needed a few rereads. But now, when I reread it, knowing that, I can kind of understand how Morrison is arranging the pieces on the board. I find that to be very satisfying. I know most people don't.
Well, first, some applause there, because I think that's a terrific encapsulation of
Thank
it.
you very much.
I mean, I think for the most part, I got the broad strokes as I was reading it. I will admit there was a little Wikipedia when I was done, just to be like, what the hell was this? But, this idea, I mean, so right. And again, we had, Morrison used Sublime, John Sublime earlier in the run, and we talked about it in the first episode, right? He is grafting, mutant organs onto humans who become the U-Men, right? So there's this, blend there, and they want to be mutants and they want the abilities and all that stuff. So, this idea, though, of the sentient bacteria, there's also mention that it, what was the gist of it? That like it caused aggression among species to prevent any one of them from ever fully winning and like you said, inheriting the earth, right?
Yeah. And again, I am not 100% behind. I've never spoken to Grant Morrison about any of this. So this is my interpretation of what I've read online. But yeah, my understanding is that Sublime as bacteria worked its way through the entire kind of like biosphere. So it talks about being in charge of the dinosaurs, being in charge of aggression, being in charge of the natural predators. This idea that it was creating the perfect conditions for its enemies to be taken off the board. And again, going back to what we said about Cassandra Nova, how Cassandra Nova is defeated by teamwork. Mutants are the end result of evolution as far as this story is concerned. It's set in the present. And I think Sublime is angry at the fact that it almost caused the conditions for humanity to show up. Like it's almost like pissed off that it couldn't take them off the board before this, but also it's benefiting from them, right? Like Sublime has the U-Men. It lives inside Beast. It created the crawlers based on the character of Nightcrawler. It's using them and it's benefiting from them. And it's the same idea that, like, as we saw with Cassandra Nova and Kid Omega and Magneto, the villains, when they just want control, they don't get anything from it. Like Apollyon, the last U-Man, the toad to John Sublime's
Right.
Magneto, keeps saying, well, why aren't you helping me? Why aren't you making me better? And Sublime, like, again, laughs at him. And it's like, I never intended to help you. And it's like, yeah, but that's why you're going to lose, because these X-Men keep talking about how you have to help everyone, even if they're being mean to you. You know, Wolverine's killed many, many, many people. He's still a teacher at this school because, you know, he wants to turn over a new leaf. And I think that's very consistent. Like Morrison is saying that the ideology of wanting to connect with your neighbor and help people and see that you're all part of the same world will always win, or should always win, over the entity that says, no, 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 I got to focus on me and mine and making sure that I am the most important thing, which again is why you reduce Magneto to a t-shirt, whereas, you know, Professor X and the X-Men, they go on, they continue in the series and they continue to be superheroes.
So I mean, I agree. I think thematically that does resonate and it does tie together, and you see that theme recur in the instances you mentioned. And so I do think the story is effective in that way. I guess, you know, as much as it kind of bugged me that, like, oh, Magneto had this impossibly intricate plot and he's manipulating events. It's like, this is that on Kick. Haha, there you go. Where it's like everything, you know, has been, you know, you've had these bacteria sort of you know, working all along. And I guess that's where it lost me a little bit. And the thing that came to mind, and I'll keep it in the Marvel realm, is Spider-Man. And I know you're a huge Spider-Man fan, and I know you know this arc. But when Straczynski took over Amazing Spider-Man and he introduced the character of Ezekiel, you know, brought up this idea that it wasn't chance that led to Peter getting his powers through that spider bite, that there was actually this spider totem that chose him. And in the context of that arc, the idea of that I was fine with. I'm like, okay, like, that's a theory, that's fine. As you know, Straczynski kept playing with this idea and it became more and more firm and started to solidify. But I didn't like that as fact. I thought as a theory, like, okay, that's fine. It's an interesting idea. But I didn't like this idea that, again, that he had been chosen. I feel like it I don't know, it takes a little something away from the character. And so that was the closest thing that kind of came to mind here, where I felt like it's too much that's been manipulated, and too much where there's this force that's been at work unseen all this time, you know, influencing so much, including, you know, all these you know, various plot points as well. So again, I don't, it's not like it's offensive to me. Going back to our, you know, Smallville crisis scene, that was this. This isn't something where, like, I'm not going to die on this hill. Like, it's fine. Like, it is what it is. But I think that did diminish my enjoyment of it a little bit. I felt like that was I don't know, a bridge too far for me.
No, that actually makes a lot of sense. The only thing I will say that I take solace in is the the dystopia that we see in Here Comes Tomorrow, 150 years from the present. It does come about because of the machinations of Sublime, but it also comes about because of what I said before, which is the school closes. And that's a big deal,
Okay.
right? Professor X goes away. He says, I can't be here for these kids. I didn't even know, you know, my arch enemy was teaching the special class. So he goes away. And then Cyclops goes away. And there's one panel, I believe, where it says, well, Hank tried his best and he couldn't keep the school open, which is actually a plot point that's incorporated into the First Class series of movies, where Beast is great, but he can't run a whole school on his own. Those aren't his skills. He needs the rest of the X-Men. And I really like that here, because I like the idea that without the purposeful move towards integration, the world would eventually fracture, especially the character of Tom Skylark, who is a human with a sentinel who is an X-Man. And I think the way of getting around the Sublime plot, because again, this Sublime, yeah, they're in charge and they're doing a lot of stuff, but again, they're really just the enemy. The main conflict comes from the fact that the world is on the brink of ending and only the X-Men can save it. And what I really like about the X-Men and Here Comes Tomorrow is they're not just mutants. They're a bunch of different things, because again, Morrison wanted to evolve the concept of the X-Men. You have Tom, who's a human. You have Rover, who's a Sentinel. You have Eva, who's an incredibly advanced Sentinel who outlived Phantom X. You have Beak's grandson, who's now a great hero who reveres his father. You have Cassandra Nova, and you have a couple other mutants. So it's this idea that you don't just stop by saying, hey, humans don't want to kill mutants anymore. You keep going until everyone of every different strain of life realizes they're all part of the same thing. And only then, when you're all together, do you realize, hey, that guy over there who's possessing our friend, who's been around since the Precambrian era and has never done anything useful in all that time, that's the bad guy. And if we can defeat him, we might be okay. We might make it to tomorrow.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
So I don't know. I mean, maybe yeah, maybe I don't need to get as hung up on the on the plot point of Sublime, I guess, and because I do think what you're saying from a thematic point of view is effective. Although so then the last bit here, because you're talking about how a lot of this does happen because the school closes, right? So there is this sequence set in the present that we spend a little time in earlier in the arc and that we end on, right? Of Emma and Scott at Jean's grave, where initially he's like, no, I'm done. I'm walking away. We find out, right? So in the future, the Phoenix egg hatches and Phoenix saves the day. And I guess through some time travel is able to because earlier in the arc, right, when or Planet X, the previous arc, when Jean is dying, there is this message seemingly from the Phoenix Force, right, telling Scott to live, right, and then so we find out in the future that she's sort of delivering this message that he needs to go on with his life because I mean ultimately the school needs to stay open and all of that, so that ties together, but I guess there too, it's like. I mean, and I don't know what your read on that is. I mean, how much is Jean actually influencing, like literally influencing Scott? Because is it, go.
No, I was just going to say my read on this is that Scott. One of the big reveals that we glossed over is that the Emma Frost, the White Queen, loves Cyclops. She loves him. It's not a plot. She's not going to betray them. She loves him. She finds a connection to this straight-laced guy who has been a teacher as long as she has, who really desperately wants to make the world a better place, and is just good. It's not trying to manipulate anyone, which is something Emma's never been exposed to, or rarely. Um, I think that Scott does like Emma and have a connection with her, but he loves Jean. And I don't think he'd ever act on it because he knows Jean's going to come back. The Phoenix returns. I mean, it's just a fact of life when you're on this team. And my read has always been that Jean, when she becomes not just the normal Phoenix, the corporeal Phoenix, but with the other Phoenix bearers at the very end, I kind of take that as being in a place outside of space and time, which is a concept Morrison has played with in other places, most notably the Invisibles, where Jean is able to manipulate things, as you said, through time travel. So Jean goes back and says, well, wait a second, what is the easiest, simplest way I can change things so that I don't have to destroy this entire continuity to remove Sublime? Well, it's by having my husband date someone else once I'm in the ground, someone he does have feelings for. So I'm just going to nudge him in that direction. So, the ensuing stories where Scott is dating Emma, which produced some amazing stories. They really, really do. I mean, again, I think this is a great sea change for the franchise, but I think it's Jean's doing. I think Jean is basically saying, listen, I'm gone. This time I'm not coming back. She does come back. This time I'm not coming back. Please go with that nice lady. Keep the school open. I may hate her. You don't. I do want you to be happy because I love you.
I guess no, that makes sense. But so I guess it's I don't know. So when he hears this message to live, right, and clearly that sort of implants, right, and then that later on when he makes the decision to stay and he kisses Emma, and that's kissing on the grave of his freshly deceased wife, mind you. I mean, I guess when I said like, what's your read on it? I mean, is it that when that idea implants in him, is it? I guess how much choice does Scott have in the end? I guess that's what I'm sort of wrestling with. Like, how much of that is his free choice versus, I mean, it's one thing to know that, okay, he has Jean's blessing, sort of like, or this sense that, like, I can do this, versus, like, he's doing this because this is really what Jean, like, is pushing him to do.
I've always read that. That's very interesting. I actually hadn't thought of it the way you're proposing, which is that he kind of knows he has her blessing and so he pursues it. I've always thought, and I could be wrong, but I've always thought that she is actually pushing him. She is actually saying, no, you feel this, but you're worried I'm going to come back. I'm not coming back. Go to her because it's important not only for you, but it's important for everything. And again, it's the simplest way to fix everything. So that's actually really interesting what you're saying because I had never considered that before. That he almost hears her voice and says, "Oh, you know what? I know it's okay to move on and move past her." I always read it as her kind of pushing him and saying, "Oh, you kind of want to do this. I'm going to make you do it." And then everything else is his decision. But I do like your read because it gives him a little bit more agency.
Well, so I think you're right though, but that's the thing.
Oh,
Like I know,
okay.
so but I no, I think your read is right, but that's I guess I dislike that. I guess this has become a little bit of a theme with me here as we're talking about this. Like I guess where it seems like there's so much that's predetermined, orchestrated, not truly the free choice of the characters, that does lose me a little bit. And so I guess especially in these last couple of arcs when I see a few instances of that, I think that's where it lost me a little bit for that reason. And I just kept like butting up against that.
That's really interesting because I think I'm beginning to get a better picture of what's going on. So, like you said, you didn't read Days of Future Past. This story is basically a retelling of Days of Future Past because something very similar happens there. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to spoil the story. But at the end, one of the characters travels, Kitty travels back into her body from the future, and she realizes like, oh, okay, great, we prevented the act I was told would create this dystopia, but there's no confirmation of that. And it ended on a similarly like very negative note. And I feel like what you're saying about how a lot of the characters aren't necessarily in control of their actions and there's just this a lot of negative energy. I feel like that's most X-Men stories. Like again, I kind of took that for granted, but yeah, I mean you're a big Superman fan. Again, Clark saves the day, goes home to Lois, which is great if you like that sort of thing. The X-Men is the complete opposite. Like the X-Men, you know, most of their members are going to die on missions and terrible things are going to happen to them and they live in this moral gray zone. I go back to the scene we spoke about in the first episode where Gene calls the Westchester County Sheriff's Department and says there are a bunch of angry people about to break down the doors of a school with teenage children. Can you please come help me? And they're like, yeah, I don't think we can do that. So she has to take matters into her own hands. And it's like, that's really dark. That's not going to happen to Superman, but it's kind of a way of life if you're an X-Man.
And I'm glad you said that because that was actually something that I was thinking about once I was done with my reading of this. And I was like, I've never been a huge X-Men guy. And I think there's a reason for that. Like I don't know that it's, oh, I just haven't read the right story yet. I mean, and again, I've read this, I read Astonishing, I read some of Ultimate X-Men. I've read some Wolverine stuff. Like I read Origin and I read some of the Greg Rucka run like in the early 2000s. Like I've read some stuff and obviously I've seen all but the last two movies. I've seen
Oh,
all of
okay.
them, and some of the cartoons and stuff like that. So it's not like, and there's stuff about them that I like, but yeah, I don't know that, like, I don't know how deeply I would really dive into X-Men lore for future podcasts or even just for
Sure,
my
sure.
own reading. That being said, I'm really glad that I read this, I truly, and for the most part, I did enjoy it. I mean, as much as there were aspects that I didn't really agree with and stuff where I felt, Morrison was like full on Morrison, but, again, there was a lot that I really liked. And as I said before, a couple of arcs that I really think I would happily go back and read in the future, reread.
Yeah.
But I don't think this is like the start of an X-Men journey for me.
I I will say that makes plenty of sense to me. There is one X-Men story that I always tell people that they should read, and it's God Loves, Man Kills. I think I referenced it before. Have you read it?
I have read that
You have.
years ago, but I
Okay.
did read that. Yeah.
I think that is the best X-Men story of all time. I think it may be one of the best comics of all time. It is by Chris Claremont, and I cannot believe I'm blanking on the name of the artist. I apologize greatly. Um, it is a one shot. It is one of the X-Men's first more adult stories. They're allowed to swear in it, and it is the rough basis for the film X-Men 2, X-Men United. It is amazing. And it has all the characters that we're talking about, but it is a much simpler, cohesive, and more emotionally charged narrative. It's very much about the racial overtones of the X-Men story. It wraps up, it ends on a very positive note. It features some of the cast here. So if anyone listening to all of this and is like, yeah, I don't know about this nonsense, please read God Loves Man Kills. It is very quick. It is very good. And you only have to look up literally anything about it to find it in everyone's top 5 X-Men stories. So I definitely would say if you're going to check out anything at all, even a single issue, God Loves Man Kills.
Right on. Is there anything else you want to say about the Grant Morrison run before we sign off?
Oh man. I mean, yes, but I'm trying to think of anything that isn't going to scare people off. I will say that, I mentioned before about the characters and concepts that survive this run, come back from this run, are immediately canceled out from this run or whatever else. I would recommend a couple of things. If anyone read this for the first time and is going on the Wikipedia or the Marvel Wiki or any of this stuff, and they're going to read the Zorn Wiki, just don't because it's all backed into and it's all a lot of what we call retconning, and it's very confusing. Brian Michael Bendis did a very famous story where he used Zorn. I don't even know how it fits into the continuity. My point is, if you're going to try to make sense of this by working how it fits into everything else, I don't think that's going to be that satisfying. But if you read this on your own and you say, hey, that weird old Jack Kirby character, Sir Ian McKellen himself, tricked the school into letting him hang out there for a while, then that's Zorn. If you want to read all the other stuff, I think it's going to make this seem weirder in retrospect. But again, Morrison had nothing to do with most of that stuff. And then the other thing I would say is going back to Assault on Weapon Plus. I love the world. I know I am in the minority here, especially with you and with most of the people I know. I just love the idea that the Weapon Plus program had so much advanced technology, right? Like the Marvel Universe is filled with interdimensional travelers, Inhumans, Eternals, mutants, all this nonsense, whatever the story requires. And they gathered all this crap up and they built a dome in Europe where time moved at a rate they could control. And the best thing they could think to come up with it was the next generation of Sentinels. Like they could have cured any problem we have on the world, and all they did was create weapons. And I love that because I feel like that is Morrison describing the very narrow worldview that people in charge can have, especially certainly back then. Again, it's very similar to the villains in the Invisibles, but I love the world. It's only appeared in a couple of stories since, again, one by Jason Aaron, but it's one of those concepts where it's like, if I was ever lucky enough to write an X-Men issue, someone's going to the world. I can tell you that.
All right. Well, you heard it here first. Listen, thank you. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better guide through this. And as I said in the last episode, this one was out of my wheelhouse a bit, but it was great to talk to you, get your insight. And again, I really am glad I read it. I enjoyed it. I echo what you said. I think anyone reading or rereading this, you really do have to look at it in a bit of a vacuum. And certainly that's what I did. And in our discussion too, it's like we treated, Zorn as actually having been Magneto, which was the intent of the story, as much as, like you said, it was retconned clumsily after. But I think you really do have to read it in terms of what was intended. And if you do, I mean, again, it's definitely an interesting story, even if there are aspects of it that didn't necessarily land for me. So thank you very much. I also, I didn't mention this last time, but, for anyone, hopefully people listen all the way through to the very end of the episode. But, at the end of each episode, I have my little outro, and I mentioned that the artwork for my Comic Shop Book Club is by Kristen Sangregorio, your lovely wife.
Yes, I do like hearing that. No, she was able to contribute to this, and I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, she did this a while back, because initially my Comic Shop Book Club, I did it as like a sub-series under my Comic Shop history before more recently making it its own full-fledged series. But she did that art a little while ago, and I'm always happy to use it. And she's done other, as you know, she's done other logos for me in the past, and including the My Comic Shop country that's behind me that our people watching might be able to see. So yeah, shout out to your wife, the graphic designer. But again, thank you for being part of this. To our audience, thank you for listening or watching. Make sure you come back in 2 weeks for the 2021 finale of My Comic Shop Book Club. I'm going to be joined by a buddy of mine named Nick Jones, and we will be discussing the 1994 DC Comics event 0 Hour. So make sure that you come back in 2 weeks. And 1 week from today, Mike will also be joining me again on Digging for Kryptonite. We're going to be talking about Superman in the Golden Age. So there's yet another episode of the two of us discussing. So I hope that you will check that out.
Yeah.
Yes, I am very excited. So thank you again. Thank you to our audience. And remember, they're all imaginary stories. My Comic Shop Book Club is a Flat Squirrel production. Art by Mike Sangregorio, music by Basic Printer. If you like what you heard, be sure to check out my other podcasts, Digging for Kryptonite and My Comic Shop History. Sign up for exclusive content, including the official book club companion podcast, at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato, and watch my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country, out now on Apple TV and Amazon.